Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Tilia for inviting me to be part of today's conference. I'm going to talk about times of change. There's a quote there that's quite poignant from Martin Luther King about change does not roll in the wheels of inevitability, but comes through continuous struggle. What I'm going to do today is to start by giving you a very, very quick look at my background, because I don't come from a social healthcare background. I'm a retired military officer. I'm currently a research fellow with Edinburgh Napier University's Centre of Military Research, Education and Public Engagement, but I've also got the honour of being a visiting fellow with Bournemouth's Faculty of Social Sciences. I've got a very, very diverse portfolio of command and leadership experience. Most recently, I was responsible for the development of doctrine, policy and delivery of command and leadership development for the Royal Air Force within the officer cadre. So very, very broad. I'm also an operational planner. I started life as a logistician, but I've got quite a diverse portfolio. It's always nice to show a nice glossy picture of yourself. So that's me. The focus for today really is I'm going to highlight some of the key themes from across the programme. I'm also going to have a look, perhaps a little bit controversially at times, and apply them to some historical events that happened on this day in history. With each one, I'll give it a little bit of a personal reflection. I won't necessarily highlight the key themes, apply those themes, offer a personal reflection. It's going to be a little bit more interactive from me there. I've given opportunity for questions at the end, but I am part of the panel later on today if anybody thinks of something as the day goes on or wants to create challenge. For me, this is all about stimulating thought process and getting individuals to really think about leadership in their own context, think about it in a wider context, and think about sometimes what we see and what we do isn't necessarily the right thing, and why not? So let's just have a look and see what happens. So first of all, in culture change, this was an interesting one. 1997, on this day, Janet Yellen became the first female president of Ghana. Why was that significant? She was the first female to be prime minister of a South American country in its entirety, and the first female prime minister of Ghana, or president of Ghana, sorry. It was quite controversial, simply because of Janet's ethnicity. She was born American, and as a consequence, there was question marks over whether she was actually eligible to run or not. So a little bit of diversity, but what we're saying here is that the culture change of having a first female president in a country that was very, very much dominated by males up to that point, and there was a lot of controversy throughout her tenure from opposition parties who were uncomfortable, one with a female, two with the politics, and three generally with the way they felt that the country was going. But really a groundbreaker in that South American environment. What does that mean for me? Well, Janet was just one of a long line of glass ceiling breakers, in my view. The first fast jet pilot in the Royal Air Force was Joe Slater in 1994. For those that don't know, the Regiment Gunner is very much the RAF's infantry units and unit organizations. And Georgia was the first female to be successfully loaded onto a course and then to successfully complete the course and go on to an operational squadron. This was significant because this was new across the British military at the time, and there was lots of question marks over whether it would create problems within the squadron and whether capability and operational output would be affected by this diversity, this approach to diversity. I'm pleased to say that the integration has gone really well, and she groundbroke for a number of people. But really, setting the culture for change. Soraya Marshall, I know Soraya Marshall very well. I worked for her when she was a group captain. I worked for her when she was a one-star. Very, very capable, very, very approachable. She became the first female to command an operational group at two-star level. That's Air Vice Marshal. what has happened over this time is that we've seen a cultural shift within the service, and it's not just gender, it includes wider areas, fundamental areas, such as men are allowed to grow beards in the Air Force. Little thing, but a shift in the paradigm of culture, particularly in the recruiting and retention, which is one of the reasons that it was perhaps looked at. But there has always been a little bit of issues with some of the females about hair lengths and having to tie it up into a tight bun. Those have been loosened. Men can now take paternity leave to share the responsibility for childcare in the early years, and they've all gone to fundamentally changing the culture of the organization. I think what I take away from that is that you see more leadership of equality, acknowledgement of the existence of bias within the service, acknowledgement that there was some disparity and some prejudice. And don't get me wrong, I think there's a long way to go, both within the service and within society, to counter this disparity and this prejudice. But every small step and every small culture change strengthens the organization and strengthens society. So I think the bit I would take away from that is that there is huge strengths within that diversity that this has created. This couldn't happen without a paradigm shift in culture. And it's people like Janet Yegan and others like her, Joe Slater, Georgina Sandover, Soraya Marshall, that really have paved the way to allow that cultural paradigm to be shifted. I'm going to play a little bit footloose with appreciative inquiry here, simply because I was following a theme that I kind of thought off the top of my head. So because I was following this theme, I'm going to play a little bit loose with it. But what I looked at was in 1773, now the Boston Tea Party didn't happen until the 16th, but lots of planning went on the night before. And if we assume, and we take what the literature suggests, that appreciative inquiry is a model that seeks to engage stakeholders in self-determined change. What we see here was a British colony that was hugely frustrated by taxation from the UK without real representation of the people there. And what this small group of people did was come together, accept that the anger and frustration, that they had an opportunity to do something about this. And really, it almost showed the catalyst for the American Revolution. So through that appreciative inquiry of engaging with stakeholders in that self-determination for change, what they did was they pulled change through. Applying that to the military, and certainly applying it probably to the public sector, actually, because the MacLeod judgment goes wider than the Royal Air Force, leading change from the bottom up. For those of you that don't know, when people joined, certainly the military and a lot of the public sector, they joined against a particular pension scheme. Now, that particular pension scheme was changed partway through without consultation, disadvantaging those that had recently joined their profession and disadvantaging them financially in the long run. A lone individual, and I think it was someone from the fire service, raised this point, put in a complaint that was upheld, and that brought about others joining in with that. So he created a stakeholder group, unknowingly created a small stakeholder group, which went on to influence the change of pensions to allow individuals to have the authority and to have the ability to basically decide, to self-determine which pension scheme they wanted to be on. What that means really is that leadership from within change happens against pressure from above. So from senior leadership, and particularly up into the governmental departments, there was huge pressure not to make this happen because it financially affects the government spending. However, that small catalyst of change from the bottom drove that change from the top. So not as dramatic as the Boston Tea Party, but certainly changed the lives for the better of a good number of people and gave them the ability to determine whether what they were going to receive in terms of pensions and rights within the service were appropriate to them. And this really was groundbreaking. It takes the organization into a whole new era. It highlighted the fact that people had the opportunity that if they saw things that were wrong, then it empowered them to make a decision to take things forward and to inculcate change if they could, where change was possible. Leading change. It's always good to have a quote from Cotter on leadership. I wouldn't necessarily agree with coping with change personally. I think it's all about influencing change. It's about influencing the environment that you operate in rather than just coping with it. And again, 15th of December, very, very much. Europe was in the height of a whole revolution. Certainly Eastern Europe was in the height of a whole revolution at this particular time. The Soviet Union was disintegrating as a organization, and organizations, countries were then stepping forward to try to be independent in their own right. And they were floundering around looking for direction. Lots of resistance to change within Romania, simply because it was very, very much a totalitarian dictatorship at the time under the Ceausescu regime. One incident that perhaps sparked the revolution within Romania was the attempted eviction of the reverend here by local militia. Local parishioners stood up to this, and the militia stood down. That simple act by the reverend and his practitioners sparked intervention. That intervention sparked clashes and violence and unrest across the country, which eventually led to the Ceausescu dictatorship being overthrown and a more stabilized government in that particular period being established. In terms of leading change, I think one of the biggest factors within the MOD in recent years has been COVID-19, because that has forced a fundamental change in leadership thinking. Traditionally, the military has got a culture of FaceTime and presenteeism, which means that if you're not seen by your bosses, if you're not seen by your chain of command, then you're not really working. And I worked in Area of High Wycombe in an air command appointment a number of years ago. And if you weren't in at 7 in the morning and you weren't there at 8, 9 o'clock at night, then you clearly weren't working hard enough, was generally the view. What COVID-19 effectively forced the military to do, particularly the Air Force, was to take a fundamental look at the way it operated and to consider those areas that could be done remotely, whether working from home was an appropriate enabler to operational output, and really whether there was a necessity anymore for that FaceTime culture. And I think in the early stages, and I must admit to being one of them, I sat at home on a laptop for the 8 to 12 hours expecting something to happen. And when nothing did, you gradually and culturally change your own styles of working to work around and suit you, so that you make sure you can get out to walk the dogs, you make sure that you can stop and have some lunch, so on and so forth. That didn't come without its own challenges. One, there was insufficient laptops and the like to go round. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is that the old style of leadership was still very, very much ingrained in senior appointments. They tended to be the more longer serving. And I think the important one here is that the different working conditions to the rest. Excuse me. It's all very well living in a very large house where you've got your own space to set up an office or have an office and sit down and work and treat it very, very much as a normal working day. The difficulty comes when you are living in a barrack block, you're trying to balance a laptop. You in a barrack block or an officer's, a senior NCO's mess, where you're trying to balance a laptop on the end of your knee, sat on the end of your bed, and put in a full day's work. And that was perhaps one of the biggest challenges we had. One was convincing leadership that there was a need to change. They had to lead that change of thinking and those new ways of working. And to be fair, most of them stood up to it and got on with it, and it's now worked very, very successfully. My wife's still serving in the military, who's actually sat next door working from home today. So we see that leading change where there was a problem that had to be overcome. Senior management, senior leadership put their heads together, came up with a solution to it and rolled it out. Leadership isn't set on stone. It's like organizational culture, possibly can never be a rational process. There were challenges to be overcome, but leadership of change is about approaching those challenges and pushing through them with successful solutions. Test and adjust, readjust. If it doesn't work, adjust, test again. If it works, move on. Influencing policy. This one isn't on the agenda for today, but I thought what I'd do is I would do a quick chat around it, simply because for me, it's one of those linchpins. It's all very, very well to change organizational culture. It's all very well to influence leadership development. But unless you change your processes at the same time or adapt your processes, then you're potentially setting yourself up to make the same mistakes again in the future. Now, we can discuss whether the first 10 amendments to the American Constitution are good or bad. And certainly it's worthy of debate, not today, unfortunately. But on the 15th of December, 1791, approximately two and a half years, just over 2.5 years after they were first proposed, the first 10 amendments to the United States Constitution, the Bill of Rights, was ratified. The significance about this is what you have is a fledgling country that laid down a constitution. And having laid down that constitution, as they start to mature as a country, they discovered there were some areas of that needed to be amended. And what they demonstrated was that there was flexibility to allow them to do that. They influenced that change. And for me, it's one of those things that don't get hamstrung by doctrine and policy. If the doctrine and policy doesn't meet the needs of the organization, then take the time to go in, study it, and make those amendments. Make the amendments for the good of the organization. Don't be hamstrung by the simple fact that, well, this is what the book says. That book can be rewritten, that book can be rechanged. It can be changed at any time. Looking at it from a service point of view, the Royal Air Force was founded out of the Royal Flying Corps and the Naval Air Service way back at the end of the First World War. Now, those two organizations brought completely different cultures and completely different rules with them. What the Air Force had to do was to take those and amend them to meet this emerging organization, to give it its own identity. Over the years, the organizational policy has had to change because the nature of warfare changes, technology advances. We have seen significant reduction in numbers of service. We talked about inclusion and diversity earlier on. Simple things like changing publications so that they become gender neutral rather than male specific. These are all factors that had to go back in and amend that policy. The situation influences policy, but also the people start to influence it by greater engagement across that diverse community. There was identification that there was a lot of areas that needed to be considered and amended and adjusted. And that's what the organization did. But that, again, comes from that appreciative inquiry. It comes from leading culture change. So you can see now where the influencing policy doesn't stand independently on its own. It really is very much dependent and very much reliant on other things that are going on around it. more recently within the Air Force, they've gone away from specialist branches and trades to professions. This is to allow greater flexibility of individuals to undertake challenging appointments and challenging opportunities outside of their core skill set, to allow them to be developed as people and to allow them to help deliver greater, wider, more diverse operational capabilities. Talent management, flexibility of resources. HR and manning policy has changed slightly as well to allow people to start to try to influence how their careers are developed, and that they're not career fouled by perhaps taking a job that is out with the perceived norm for their trade or their specialization. And that really has influenced the Air Force's leadership vision in the greater picture. But it's also established a roadmap for the future and hopefully take the service forward. Greater reduction in manpower. My own experience, when I joined the Royal Air Force way back in 1988, I am really that old. Way back in 1988, we had about 120,000 people. The Air Force now sits at round about 32,000, with about 4,000 to 6,000 reservists on top of that. So that 36,000 to 38,000 people are fundamentally doing the same job that 120,000 did. And you can't do that without change. And you can't do that without influencing those policy decisions at the top. That all comes together like this. So what I've looked at there is we've got cultural change, appreciative inquiry, and leading change. And they're all integrated. As I've just spoken, you can't have cultural change without leadership, that leading with change, and without that appreciative inquiry. And again, you can't have leading change without changing the culture, and so on. So they're all really interrelated. Sitting outside of those is that influencing policy. Central to that, I've put resilience. I'm talking resilience in a leadership context. And I'll talk perhaps a little bit about resilience in a moment. Very, very conscious of my time. Resilience to me fits into three parts. It sits into physical, mental, and spiritual. Physical resilience is all about being capable of undertaking the job that you've been asked to do, and to adapting physically to the challenges that appointment is going to create. Mental resilience is all about being mentally able to perhaps change your thought process, to consider things in a different manner, to be able to operate when under physical stress mentally, to make sound leadership and management decisions at that point. And then spiritual is not necessarily about religion. It's about having the belief that what you're doing is right, and it's for the good, and it's for the people that you work with and the people that work for you. It's about that element of self-belief. And when we bring those all together, those are all so integrated with each other. I believe they can't operate independently. So key to cultural change, appreciative inquiry, and the leadership change, and that influence of policy is that resilience. Leaders will always come up against someone who says absolutely not in a senior appointment. And it's having that resilience, those three pillars of that resilience, to help you drive your way through that, or to at least try to influence that decision-making process. I thought I'd finish with a couple of slides just to sort of contextualize some of that from Colin's perspective. When we talk about the Ministry of Defence and the change cycle, and this may resonate with other areas of the public sector, there's a general election every 5 years. So we see a change in government or a re-election of government with changing priorities. Generally, that leads to a strategic defence and security review, which happens approximately in a 5-year cycle, sometimes shorter, sometimes a little bit longer, but that's very, very much government-led. That will then determine where the government wants its defence and security to go over the next 5 years. That tends to be aligned with political agendas, and government policy that's created in the lead up to that election. What we then see within the military, and I've used the Chief of the Air Staff as an example here, a new Chief of the Air Staff is appointed every 2 to 3 years. Now, we've seen turmoil created by general election. We've seen a little bit of turmoil created by a strategic defence review as priorities are tested and adjusted. We've now replaced that with a new Chief of the Air Staff who comes in with their own views as to where they believe the organisation is going to go during their tenure. We add on to the top of that the executive stream in the Air Force is sort of wing command and above that have undertaken certain training courses. They change every 2 to 3 years because of the posting cycle, that promotion cycle, building up their own individual capability. So they change appointments every 2 to 3 years. They've got to make their mark, as has the Chief of the Air Staff, as directed by the Strategic Defence Review, as directed by the government. So what you see is change programs that come in and last for 1 to 3 years, 1, 2, 3 years, probably at the most. And just when that's settling down, we have a general election. And the whole cycle starts again. Now, within the executive appointments, that's not so much of an issue, because what happens with them is they move on. They come in and bless them, they create carnage, and then they implement change programs, and then they move on to the next appointment where their replacement comes in with a different view and a different vision, implements change programs, which creates carnage at the grassroots levels because there's more stability within the junior ranks than there is within the officer corps. So what you're seeing is a new broom come in every 2 to 3 years. Good visionary, inculcates change in theory improves the quality of life of the individuals around them. The reality is, what it does is it creates ambiguity, in my view. And ambiguity, the military are taught very, very much that operational ambiguity is something that you should be relatively comfortable with. That's the fog of war. That's people doing their daily jobs. And this may be reflected into other parts of perhaps social care. People get up in the morning and go and do the job that they're trained to do. They have the skill set and the training to do it. They are relatively comfortable in that environment. They have got the tools that they require to do it. Where the problem lies, and this for me is one of the biggest challenges with leadership and that resilience piece we talked about a minute ago, the biggest challenge is in organizational ambiguity. And that's the implementation of change programs. It's the frequent turnover of senior managers, and it's the frequent redirection from the government. Now, there are external factors, COVID-19 being one of them, the crisis in Ukraine, the crisis that's currently happening in the Middle East, are all factors that influence organizational ambiguity. But without good communication, and for communication, I include listening skills as part of that. If you don't have that good communication as a leader, and you don't articulate why change is there, and you can't demonstrate why change is good for the organization, then what you're going to get is an uncomfortable workforce that will generally vote with their feet. So I think the takeaways for me at this point, change is a fact of life. And for me, it can never be a rational process. It's got people involved in it, therefore there's emotion. Where there's emotion, it can never realistically be rational. You never please all of the people all of the time. Some of the events, or many of the events I discussed a minute ago over this last 10, 15 minutes or so, are either born out of necessity or uncertainty, or an amalgam of both of those. The leadership challenge is to create clarity from that necessity or that uncertainty, to give the direction to take people forward. Don't be surprised if the catalyst that sparks a revolution and that influences outcomes, it may be completely unexpected. You may not get the output that you want, and I know on occasions where senior commanders have stood up expecting a fight from the workforce over a particular direction, to be said, yeah, great idea, let's just crack on and do it. Completely unexpected. For me, though, change requires shift in the cultural paradigm, strong leadership and the support of the people. And I think for me, one of the fundamental differences between leadership and management is that leadership is about being a visionary. And it's about, I think, as the professor said in the introduction, leadership is an art. And if you look, there are hundreds of thousands of books written on leadership. There's hundreds of thousands of articles written on leadership. Why? In my view, leadership means different things to different people. And one of the challenges for leaders is to tailor their leadership to meet the organizational requirements as well as the requirements of the people, what the people want to do. And you can't do that without being resilient, having that resilience to rise above the challenges, to tackle the problems head on, and really to do the right thing for both your organization and your people. And I think on that, you've probably heard enough from me. So I will either take any questions or impart the panel later, at which point we can discuss any of these issues.
Thank you so much, Colin.